Yeah. So I wanted to start by just letting everybody know the program is going to end probably around 7, maybe a little earlier, depending on kind of what kind of conversation we have. I am by no means an expert on Butler, but I teach her materials with some frequency. I am a scholar of African American literature at Vassar College, and I have taught for a number of semesters a course on Afrofuturism, of which Butler's work is one of those foundational texts. She's a foundational author. I should also warn you all, I have an infant who is probably going to wake up in the middle of this presentation. And she's either going to scream and come in, or I'm going to have to kind of go and get her and bring her in. So I may have kind of technical difficulties, so bear with me. And hopefully you won't mind it too much. So I'm going to get started. I have a PowerPoint, and I'm going to go through it. And then the PowerPoint has some kind of space for videos. So I've pulled some materials, some videos, some sound of Octavia Butler, and interspersed it with kind of my talking points. I feel like I would be cheating you if I didn't have Butler's voice and image here for you. The other thing I want to say in terms of this presentation is it really is an introduction. And by that, I mean kind of I'm going to just touch the surface. I'm presuming if you're here, you've probably read some, either science fiction, Black science fiction, or in particular, Octavia Butler. And hopefully when we get to Q&A or conversation is what I would like to call it, you can share kind of what you want. Okay, I see somebody's background. Okay, Anthony is what the kids call a stan. So the other thing I want to say by way of introduction is that Chris was, when he asked me to do this presentation, kind of said, just bring everybody from the beginning to this current moment with the I forget the phrasing, but basically the end of Roe v. Wade. And I thought when he said that, I was like, well, that seems like an odd place to end. But in some ways, I'm going to end there. And I'm going to kind of think about what Butler has, what she did as a writer that might kind of speak to this contemporary moment, not just the end of Roe v. Wade, but all sorts of larger issues that are affecting us. So if you all will bear with me, I'm going to come in and out of sharing my screen. So I'm going to share my screen with this PowerPoint. So I'm going to get very small in the corner. If you want and know how to pin me so that I always appear at the top, that's fine. Okay, I should be shared. And now where? Can everybody see that? If you can't see the first slide, kind of unmute and say, I have no idea what's going on. But if I hear silence, then I know I'm good. Okay, so Octavia Butler. I chose this quote to sort of start us off with because I really want to kind of set the scene for Butler as someone who's destined to make herself a writer. And I think that that's important to understand about Octavia Butler in terms of perseverance, in terms of being a Black woman in science fiction at a time when both women and Black people, marginal isn't the right word, I think almost non-existent is a better way to understand what Butler kind of entered into as a Black woman wanting to write science fiction. She was absolutely a unicorn. So by way of biography, for those folks who may not be as familiar with Butler, I'm just going to run through a lot of this and do a little bit of ad-libbing. So she's born in California in 47 in Pasadena, raised by her mother. When she does interview, she talks about this and the fact not that she didn't have a father, but that she was raised by her mom and grandmother, because I think that that shaped her early experience with class in particular. So she's really a working class writer, working poor writer. She was working class for most of her writing life. And so she talks a lot about the work that she did in order to support herself so that she could write. And we'll watch a clip where she talks about that. She didn't get an MFA, you know, so those of you who may be aspiring writers, you don't have to get an MFA. You can write, and that's what she did. She has an associate's degree from Pasadena City College, although she did attend courses at UCLA and Cal State LA, right? But she never took a degree. She did participate in this Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, which during the time that she went in 1970 was actually housed in Clarion, Pennsylvania. You can raise your hand if you're from Pennsylvania. I am. It is always odd to me that she, coming all the way from California, would end up in Clarion, Pennsylvania, learning or participating in writer's workshop to hone her craft in science fiction writer. I like that. That makes me feel a little bit more connected to her. She, in 1976, sold her first novel, Pattern Master, into Doubleday. Again, big deal, 70s. She's a Black woman writing in this genre. And she doesn't hide her gender or her race like a number of women science fiction writers would give themselves gender neutral names in order to be accepted in the science fiction fold. So she sort of is herself from the beginning of her career, and that's important. It makes her a pioneer. Going towards that, I wanted to highlight the fact that she wins a Nebula and Hugo Awards in '83, and then '84 she wins them for novels. Those two are the biggest at that point in time science fiction writing awards that one could earn. So the fact that she, again, as a Black woman, is earning the top awards in the field, in the genre, I think speaks to her kind of significance. And the other is the MacArthur Genius, which she is part of the class of 1995. So it's the MacArthur Fellowship, right? But we call it the Genius Award. They just announced their most recent class of geniuses. A colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, was among them, which is very funny to me. But this award allows Butler to really kind of settle into, in the kind of later part of her life, a bit more comfort. So the Genius Award Fellowship usually, I don't know what the amount was in 1995, but for the past number of years, it's been about $500,000. This year, they increased it to $800,000. And that award is disseminated over 5 years. So if you could imagine somebody who had been working class, a working person their entire lives, coming into that kind of money, it just frees them up. And again, in one of the scenes that I pull, she'll talk a little bit about what it allows her to do, the Genius Award. She dies in 2006. So about 10 years after winning the Genius Award. She wasn't in great health, but this was kind of a shock. I remember when it happened, everybody was kind of in shock. I think, and somebody in the audience can correct me, but I think she had been suffering from kind of hypertension, the effects of hypertension or something kind of related to blood pressure, and just kind of passed out, and in the passing out, hit her head on the sidewalk. And so it was a freak accident. And she then kind of was taken, from us much too soon. Here comes my daughter. Okay. So I'm gonna have to share again. Okay, can you guys see that? Okay. For some reason, it's out of sync. Okay, there we go. So I'm just going to go through the covers of all the books that she published. Pattern Master in 76, Mind of My Mind in 77, Survivor in 78, Kindred in 79, which I'm going to talk a bit about, Wild Seed in 80. She's prolific, right? 84, Clay Ark. Also in 84, a collection of short stories, the titular Blood Child. There's a short story in that collection it's named after. The Exogenous series, Dawn, which I'm going to talk a bit about, and Adulthood Rights and Imago. The Evening, in the Morning, Night, Parable of the Sower, which I will also talk about, Parable of the Talents, which is the follow-up of Sower. This was going to be a 3-book series, but she only ended up getting to 2. And then the final novel, Fledgling. She was, of course, writing until the very end of her life. Again, like I said, she was kind of unexpectedly, died unexpectedly. So those are all of the text. I want to, and I'm going to have to stop the share in order to show a video that I want to kind of share with you guys, where Butler herself talks about what being a Black woman and why science fiction, and why writing, why those things were important to her. So I have to share the screen, but it'll be a different screen. And if you can't hear it, let me know.
What was it about writing for you? Oh, you got to make your own worlds. You got to write yourself in. Whether you were a part of the greater society or not, you got to write yourself in. So I got to write myself in.
And you get to do it in the limited worlds, you say, because there are no walls, there are no limits.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, you treat science, you treat subjects like race, sexual prejudice,
sure,
all of that.
Mm-hmm.
You can put that in
I
a
write
context
about people.
that has.
I write about people and the different ways of being human, and you can't really do that unless you write about a lot of different kinds of people.
Has it been difficult for you?
It was horrible at first. I have a book called Kindred. It's my 4th published book. And in Kindred, my character is a new writer. And she has lots of horrible little jobs: cleaning, warehouse, factory, office, you name it, food processing.
All jobs you knew.
All jobs I've done. And I mean, some that I didn't even put in because they were just so bad.
What's the best part of where you are now?
Well, I don't have to worry about how to pay the mortgage.
Yeah.
I get to write the stories that I want to write and not worry that maybe they won't be accepted, because They already have been. I can recall my best friend telling me back when I was working on my first novel that I really should change some things because they were perhaps going to have the wrong attention drawn to them. And thank goodness I paid no attention.
What's the daylight then for you? You still get
Okay, so a couple of things I want to highlight in that. One, we hear Butler talking about how how many terrible jobs she had and how she didn't even put all of those terrible jobs that she did while kind of beginning her career as a science fiction writer in a book like Kindred. So again, kind of thinking about her to me as a working class, working person who happens to be also a phenomenal writer, I think is important. Also, she talks about kind of at that point in time in her career, by the time she's on Charlie Rose, that she feels financially stable. And I think, again, that's really important to me as a scholar of African-American literature, thinking about what it takes for Black writers, or any writer, but particularly for Black writers, to enter into a profession where money isn't promised. How do you navigate that? And I think Butler represents that kind of navigation. And in some ways, is a holdout, for hope for, I think, a lot of young writers. Perhaps during Q&A or conversation, we can talk a little bit about kind of the writers, the contemporary speculative fiction Black writers, and how Butler's success opens a door for them. So I'm gonna go back to sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Okay. So one of the things she kind of intimated, and I think this passage is more explicit, right? When I began writing science fiction, when I began reading, heck, I wasn't in any of the stuff I read. The only Black people you found were occasional characters, or characters who were so feeble-witted that they couldn't manage anything anyway. I wrote myself in, since I am me and I am here and I am writing. And I think that idea of entering into a genre that doesn't kind of represent you in the way that you want to be represented, right? The idea that you could find Black people, if you did find them, however, they were the butts of jokes, they were unintelligent, they were caricatures. And so her job, she says, is to write herself into this world of possibility. So how does she do it? She mentioned Kindred in that interview. So Kindred, for those of you who haven't read it, it's the 1979 book that she writes. It's the story of Dana, who is contemporary, and by contemporary, the novel is set in the bicentennial year of the United States, so 1976. And in that text, Dana moves from, she's also out in California, is sort of drawn back. The time travel element of this story is unclear, but she's drawn back into the antebellum period. And she lands on the farm from which her ancestors kind of emerged, the plantation. And her character's job, Dana's job, is to sort of figure out kind of where she is, why she's there. And she soon realizes she's there in order to participate in a relationship that is going to produce the line of her family. That relationship is between this young white boy that she meets for the first time when she's drawn back, Rufus is his name, who is a child. And we watch her move back in time, back from the past to the present, over and over, and Rufus ages. But she's also drawn back for her matriarchal line. And it becomes really clear that what's going to happen is rape. That Rufus, the boy that she saves in the first scene, is going to have to rape her maternal ancestor in order for the family line to get developed. So the character Dana has to sort of figure out not only how do I navigate being a Black woman under enslavement when I've been free my entire life, but what does it mean to participate in the plantation system, knowing what she knows has to happen in order for her to live. And that kind of ethical dilemma is something that Butler, not this particular iteration, but these kinds of ethical dilemmas is really what she is profoundly interested in. In this case, this particular novel, unlike most of her novels, has a science fiction element, again, time travel, but there's a historical realism to it. So it's probably the most realistic. And I'm going to put that in quotes because we're going to talk about the Parable series in a bit. But let's say the most, for its moment, the most realistic fiction that she wrote. Okay, so that was Kindred. I want to kind of, again, show another video of Butler talking about the writing of Kindred. So we're going to watch two people who tape a podcast. Their podcast is sound, right? But they videotape themselves making sound, making the podcast. So it's a little bit weird. So they're going to be listening to Butler, and we're going to watch them listen to Butler, and we're going to listen to Butler along with them. So there's a lot of layers to this one. Okay, so let me go back to find this podcast, and again, you'll see one of them, Tanana Reeves, is a contemporary science fiction writer. I'm gonna share my screen again as soon as I find the right screen to share. Okay. So, like I said, they're going to be listening to Butler talk about her process, her writing process, and sort of what it meant to write Kindred. I should say these tapes, these videos that I'm showing, if, you know, while you're listening or watching, if you have questions, again, I don't know if I'll be able to answer them. Perhaps we can answer them during Q&A. But if you have questions, please write them down. If you have reflections, please write those down, and that'll be the kind of stuff of our conversation. So let's see.
I'd like to know something about the overall cycle of your work between initial inspiration on a project and the final draft, sending it into the editor. You know, research is in there, inspiration is in there, work is in there, but just how would you describe that cycle?
Well, for one thing, it doesn't go to the editor until I feel that it's really ready for publication. And that's always been the way I've worked. But goodness, it's not always the same. I mean, I don't have one method that works for all my novels. You know, for instance, my early writing, the whole process was different, just because these were stories that I had, as I tell people, in the trunk. Right. And I think we all begin that way. We have these stories that we've been carrying around for years and years. In my case, I've been carrying Pattern Master around since I was 12. Wow. And Mind of My Mind since I was 15. Survivor since 19, and Kindred since college. Right. And these were all things that I wanted to write. And I had incomplete ideas, and what I kept doing in the first 3 cases was writing novels that never ended. You know, I didn't really know how to write a novel, I didn't know, for instance, that in my case, I really do need to know the end before I begin.
Otherwise, it will just go on.
Yeah, just sort of kind of wander off into the ether. And I don't know, I after I finished The Trunk, and that wouldn't just be those novels, but for instance, Clay's Ark would have been part of it, just because I had always said I wanted to do a novel on how the Clay Arks came to be. Wild Seed would have been part of it, although Wild Seed was more in a line of giving myself a reward for having finished Kindred.
Oh, yeah.
Kindred was a long, depressing ride. And
Because it's like the woman was going through.
Because I really had to do enough research so that I had to understand it on a level that I didn't really want to understand.
Exactly.
Was there any specifically most disturbing thing that you came to realize about the institution of slavery
Yeah,
that you had not understood before?
it's well, it's not that I hadn't understood it, because in a way the reason I wrote this novel was because I did understand something of it. It's just that there's a difference between understanding it and feeling it.
Yes.
And that was what I was going for, the feeling.
So which aspect of slavery specifically struck you
It's
most deeply?
something that is best expressed by a quotation that I came upon much later from Steve Biko.
Okay.
It's something like this: the most effective weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed.
Yes.
Mm.
Yes.
And I mean, that's not totally accurate, but it's very close to what he said.
So I think what drew me to share that particular video with you all, or audio with you all, is again, kind of the way that Butler imagined herself as a writer as a 12-year-old, right? She talked about in that having stories in the trunk, stories that she'd been working over, thinking about since she really was a tween, what we would call a tween, and a teenager and somebody in her late teens, that would become part of her corpus, and that these were long-standing projects for her. By the time we get to the 80s, I would suspect she has kind of finished with her trunk and is kind of developing new stories. So let me share my screen and go back to the PowerPoint, and then we'll move forward with the next kind of set of slides. Okay. So Parable of the Sower. If anybody has read Butler, they've either probably read Kindred, or more recently they've read Parable, the Parable series that I said was supposed to be a 3-part series, but is in fact just 2 parts, 2 books. And she writes this book in the 90s. The thing that I want to highlight, right, is what she describes as kind of happening in 2024, which is, I don't know in the 90s if that seemed far away, but it feels, we know 2024 is right at our doorstep. The kind of world that she imagines is so close to the world in which we live that I think people kind of discuss her as kind of clairvoyant. But, and the video I'm going to show, she talks about kind of how she came to this particular story. But what I want to highlight is one of the things that she says. So Parable of the Sower is kind of California in the early 2020s. It is world of haves, of very few haves and way more have-nots, the American middle class has kind of dropped out of existence. So most Americans are just kind of trying to live in a landscape that environmental degradation has kind of taken hold of. And she imagines a young woman as the protagonist of this series who has what she calls hyper-empathy, meaning she can feel other people's feelings, which in a world that is falling apart is incredibly detrimental and dangerous for Lauren, who's the protagonist. And so we watch her after she loses her family. And she's traveling north to find what would be kind of a promised land. And she takes on a number of fellow travelers in order to kind of get to this new world that they're hoping for. Sorry, my daughter's here. So one of the things that Butler talks about in developing this story is she was reading the newspapers and the newspapers were predicting basically the collapse of the climate collapse, right? And she thought, okay, if we keep going like this, what will the world be like? And she got pretty close to what the world's going to be like, or what the world may be, depending on kind of how you see it. And she will tell you, it wasn't that she was kind of channeling the future. She was living in the present and imagined kind of it playing out. And so I want to highlight that as kind of really a powerful idea for thinking about. I was around in the 90s. I don't know, and I don't know what we were thinking, but I have to say, like, I just saw a news article about kind of 60% of the global wildlife being gone, right, or near extinction. And so you just think, okay, how did we get here? And in some ways, Butler's going to tell us how. So this next clip is Butler in 2005, very close to her death, discussing on Democracy Now! And reading from Parable. So let me stop share, and I'm going to again go to a video of Butler talking about herself as a writer and Parable in particular. Share the screen.
And there are no required formulas. You can go anywhere with it.
We're talking to Octavia Butler. Her latest book is Fledgling, wrote the Parable series as Katrina was happening, in the aftermath of Katrina. A lot of people were talking about Octavia Butler and how the Parable series made them think about that. Explain.
I wrote the two Parable books back in the 90s. And they are books about, as I said, what happens because we don't trouble to correct some of the problems that we're brewing for ourselves right now. Global warming is one of those problems. And I was aware of it back in the 80s. I was reading books about it. And a lot of people were seeing it as politics, as something very iffy, as something they could ignore because nothing was going to come of it tomorrow. That and the fact that I think I was paying a lot of attention to education because a lot of my friends were teachers, and the politics of education was getting scarier, it seemed to me. We were getting to that point where we're thinking more about the building of prisons than of schools and libraries. And I remember while I was working on the novels, my hometown, Pasadena, had a bond issue that they passed to aid libraries. And I was so happy that it passed because so often these things don't. And they had closed a lot of branch libraries and were able to reopen them. So not everybody was going in the wrong direction, but a lot of the country still was. And what I wanted to write was a novel of someone who was coming up with solutions of the sort. My main character's solution is grows from another religion that she comes up with. Religion is everywhere. There are no human societies without it, whether they acknowledge it as religion or not. So I thought religion might be an answer as well as, in some cases, a problem. And in, for instance, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, it's both. So I have people who are bringing America to a kind of fascism because their religion is the only one they're willing to tolerate. On the other hand, I have people who are saying, well, here is another religion, and here are some verses that can help us think in a different way, and here is a destination that isn't something that we have to wait for after we die.
Octavia Butler, could you read a little from Parable of the Talents?
I'm going to read a verse or two, and keep in mind these were written early in the 90s, but I think they apply forever, actually. This first one, I have a character in the books who is someone who is taking the country fascist and who manages to get elected president, and who oddly enough comes from Texas. And here is one of the things that my character is inspired to write about this sort of situation. She says, choose your leaders with wisdom and forethought. To be led by a coward is to be controlled by all that the coward fears. To be led by a fool is to be led by the opportunists who control the fool. To be led by a thief is to offer up your most precious treasures to be stolen. To be led by a liar is to ask to be lied to. To be led by a tyrant is to sell yourself and those you love into slavery. And there's one other that I thought I should read because I see it happening so much. I got the idea for it when I heard someone answer a political question with a political slogan.
Okay, so they cut her off soon after that. They have very limited time, apparently, on Democracy Now! So part of what I want to highlight again from that is Butler really articulating that this is in some ways speculative, in the sense that she's speculating what will happen if we go down the path that we were on as a country. And in fact, much of what Parable explores is very kind of close to what we are, I think a number of people feel like the country is experiencing at this moment. I'm going to try to move rather quickly through the last parts of this presentation because I do want to have time to discuss. So that was from 2005. They're saying in 2005, people were feeling like Parable really spoke to the post-Katrina. But who knows? I think it speaks to a lot of stuff happening now personally. The other texts that I want to highlight are the Lilith's Brood series, Dawn. This is a series that she writes 87. And one of the things that I want to highlight is that this is a story that lacks realism in the sense that it's about alien encounters. This book, when Chris asked me to do this presentation and said that I should end it with Roe v. Wade, I started thinking about this. I think that perhaps not the end of Roe v. Wade, but the idea of body autonomy. So this particular story imagines a future in which a human population has pretty much destroyed through war the planet, made it inhospitable. Centuries later, a woman, Lilith, is resurrected by the Oankali, which are an alien species that kind of move through the universe and mate with other species in order to sort of continue to develop their own species health, ultimately, to sort of rectify whatever health issues they have by mating with other species that kind of plug the gaps. And in that mating, a whole new species is developed, right? So it's all about kind of mixing, and it's not race mixing, it's really species mixing. And part of that series really imagines what would happen, what would you do again, right? What would you do if you're faced with, as Lilith is faced with, this idea that in order for humanity to survive, they have to give up humanity as they know it and mate and meld with this new species. The question of autonomy and choice is really at the bottom of this series, which is to say, over some time, you realize, or the humans realize, that the aliens, the Oankali, have the capacity to make them want things, right? So that there's a real question of, how do I know if my consent is being respected when the species that I'm dealing with can kind of make me say yes, right? So it's got everything. It's got these deep questions about, what does it mean to be a human? What is, if humanity has sort of destroyed the world, does it deserve to continue anyway? What do we hold dear as kind of humans, as our humanity? Again, these questions of consent and body autonomy, and procreation. So this is a really, if you're really sort of into those questions, this series kind of will really put you through the ringer in thinking about what would you do. The next book I want to highlight is her last novel, Fledgling, which is a really weird vampire book. And she imagines a little girl, a person who presents as a young girl under the age of 10, I would say, who is in fact 53 years old in vampire life, but was turned as a child. She is a kind of new sort of vampire. She's a vampire with black skin. Vampires have genetically developed her strain, her family strain, because she has the capacity to go out during the day. And they really want to be able to move in and out of life, not in the dark. But she's kind of has amnesia and doesn't know who she is or why she is. And over the course of the story, you realize why she has amnesia. But these same questions, again, of consent, of appropriate sexual relationships, what does it mean to agree to something when the person, in this case, the vampires, have the capacity to glamour, have the capacity to make humans do what they want. So she's always sort of thinking about these questions, again, of consent, of autonomy, of a future, and how do we participate in it. So that brings us to the end of her life. After she died, like I said, she died rather unexpectedly. But after she died, her papers, all of her writing that she had collected, was bought by or donated to the Huntington Center and the Huntington Library in California. And what I want to say about that is if you're ever free and looking to travel and really interested in Butler, you can go to the library, the Huntington Library, and go through all of her notebooks. So I've pulled a few images from the online, sorry, my daughter's reached her end, from the online archive that they have visible. And what I want to just highlight here is, again, the kind of self-talk that she's doing in her kind of notebooks regarding what she wants as a writer. I shall be a best-selling writer. After Imago, each of my books will be a bestseller on the list of the LA Times, the New York Times, the Publishers Weekly, so on and so forth. Tell stories filled with facts, make people touch and taste and know, make people feel. And then this last image, which is the image of the alien species that, as she imagines it, that humans in the series Lilith's brood have to mate with. So it's really interesting to me to see what she was imagining that alien species looking like. Okay, so I'm at the end. If you want more information, there's a little bit more. You can check these sites out. So I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, wow. We have about 10 minutes. Sorry that took so long. Oh, no. Yeah, about 10 minutes. We can go a little bit over since my daughter's awake, but I do need to put her to sleep. I thought it might be nice to kind of go around to everybody who's here. You don't have to make yourself visible, but if you could take yourself off mute. I thought it would be nice to go around and just kind of share, if you're a Butler reader, what you've read and why it matters to you. And if you're not a Butler reader, kind of what science fiction you have read or watched, and why it matters to you. And then we'll see what we can generate from there. I'm also happy after everybody kind of shares to talk and answer any questions that I might. So I don't know, I'll just keep track of who's spoken and we can open it up.
I'm happy to kick things off. I am not the Newburgh Free Library. I'm actually a very happy member of the Newburgh Free Library who lives down the street, who tried to sign up late and it was closed. So I just ran here, and I'm so grateful for Heather letting me literally just jump on her computer. My name's Lisa Pellegrino. Eve, thank you so much.
Oh gosh, thanks, Lisa. Thanks for coming into the gap too.
Oh yeah, it was such an incredible auspice to see the flyer for this event. I recently finished a book called Immersion Strategy. So I have not read any of Octavia's work, but Adrienne Marie Brown cites her work so heavily, and I have Parable the Sower, and I've started a little bit, and I just always so driven to nonfiction that it's hard to prioritize fiction. But I am deeply, deeply interested in what matters to me, right? Or like the things that have informed Adrienne's work around like, how does nature organize, especially, for, social movements. And I particularly with the sci-fi, I'm not even a Trekkie, but like, I just love even thinking about 24th century economics and the clips I've seen of Picard explaining, like, we don't have money, like everyone just goes and pursues what's best for themselves and society. And there's just this, it's like, just makes it seem so like, I'm like, why aren't we there? And, but so I just am still processing all the beautiful things that were shared. I love the line I wrote myself in. Whoa. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lisa.
I'm Eugene Hammond. I love science fiction from when I was a kid and read a lot of it. And then the first time I read Octavia Butler, It was probably from the Newburgh Library, which had a section of Black writers near the front desk. And I was so impressed that science fiction included stuff about the real world and the problems that were going on. And it just hooked me. Yeah. So I guess I must have read Parable of the Sower, and I'm not sure what else I read. It was quite a while ago. You want to talk more?
I'm Nora Haddon though I write, and I self-published a couple of books under my second, and I just wanted to see this different genre of writing, and the fact that she used, which I like to do, current issues within her writing, and then looking at the current issues from the past, which were then current issues. I also went to LA College at Los Angeles, University of Los Angeles, and I'm just very impressed about her history and her honesty as a person and as a writer during her that I witnessed during the interviews. So, but thank you for having this.
Thank you. And I think that that idea that, you know, for me, that she embodies, like, again, like I said, the possibility that we all might be writers, right? That we all have something to say. And again, this idea that there are gaps in the reading world, in the writing world, and we're here to fill them with ourselves or with the things that we're passionate about. So I appreciate that. Christine, would you mind going? And the prompt was, yeah, anything you want to say about Butler or any other sci-fi that you've kind of.
I finished Octavia Butler. I've been super sad that I don't have any more Octavia Butler books. And so part of my like motivation for coming here is to find other people that maybe have other ones. Maybe you could throw them in the chat of, like, there's a couple writers that I'm like, oh yeah. N.K. Jemisin is one of the people that makes it not so sad that Octavia Butler died. And like, but so I'm just sitting here waiting for her next book kind of thing. So who else should I be reading?
Yeah, I can, and again, I'll open, I think people throwing things in the chat is good too, but I'm looking at my shelf, Nalo Hopkins, The Brown Girl in the Ring. I'm not sure if you've read that. The other thing that I would suggest is a book titled The Unkindness of Ghosts. They are a young queer writer, genderqueer writer. I can't read the last name, but I can drop it. But The Unkindness of
Find
Ghosts.
it.
Yeah. I would say they are kind of, I'm sorry?
No, sorry, my daughter's in the room wanting my attention.
Oh, I thought somebody was going to fill in the author name, but yeah, those are two writers. I mean, who I would suggest, and anybody else wants to suggest.
Thank you. That was a very interesting presentation too. Appreciated it.
Thank you, Anthony.
Yeah, I actually was just thinking about, I've read most of her novels. I actually read them. I started reading some of them pretty young. Orson Scott Card is one person you might want to read. He's an older author, but actually first he used the opening of Wild Seed as a teaching tool in his book about writing science fiction, and that's how I first heard about Octavia Butler. But yeah, I think like a lot of people have said, I think it's very interesting how her like relative lack of formal education and she was sort of outside the mainstream, and just as a writer, her creativity is pretty incredible. I think all like the Xenogenesis in particular, like some of the things are just, I think people criticized her having like a very simple writing style, but I really like the way she writes, and I think that it highlights how just these incredible stories. She was really a natural person. The idea that she had this, like at 16, was singing about xenogenesis is pretty amazing to me. And she just has this incredibly like mature and like interesting approach to like sexuality in all of her books, and writes in a way that like other people I think were afraid to write. I mean, fledgling is a great example. And apparently they're going to make that to a TV show, which I really don't understand how they're going to do that. Because like you said,
Yeah.
a lot about the book is about this, like, you know, reading as a sexualization of like a 10-year-old girl, but she's actually an adult of a different species, which is just so classic to what the way, like the little tension she builds into things, which I think is just fascinating.
Yeah, I cannot imagine what they're going to do to make fledgling like not rated X. So yeah, that'll be.
I just think it would be very uncomfortable viewing if you did it right. It's supposed to be uncomfortable.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly, I taught that novel I've taught a course on Butler, and yeah, my students everybody's uncomfortable. It's incredibly uncomfortable. But yes, thank you, Robin.
Hi, thank you so much for this. I think you asked us to say what we've read, and so I'm not really like a big sci-fi person, but I did read her Parable series a few years back and was excited to join this presentation. And I loved, like Lisa said, like the writing yourself in element. I loved hearing about her as an artist, and sort of there was, you know, sort of the books within us, as well as there's so many, you know, sort of artist creator people in my life, including my son, who might is applying to Vassar, and he was too shy to go on camera, but he was super excited about you possibly being one of his professors. And I can say the same as far as, you know, like your presentation. It was just really good and compelling, and just thinking about myself, my friends who are writers, and just in general, people who are trying to create, you know, whether it be writing or filmmaking or whatever else, sort of hearing about the decision making of all that, and then also what's on the line if you do sort of put yourself out there as like, I'm going to do this thing that's not a definite thing, you know, I'm going to invest a lot of time and energy into this thing, and it might be just to be a writer, you have to write. So like, you just might be doing it for the commitment to the craft, or and then also talking about like the trunk, where I feel like it was interesting to hear her talk about how different books are, quote, you know, the way I think of it as born. So sometimes something sort of comes to you, and sort of like you're just have this, I have to birth it, like I have to bring this to life, and then it's literally like, so my publisher is saying I have to create something, so let me read this newspaper, let me see what sparks, let me see what comes. So that was all really, really interesting, that, you know, came from your presentation. So that was awesome. And if you at some point don't mind, I missed the last slide. I wanted to kind of copy some of that down, so if you don't mind putting it up again, but thank you.
Do that here at the end. Thank you so much. And yeah, I appreciate what you're saying too about kind of embarking on a career that isn't a career until it's a career, but then sort of committing to it. And I really love that about her. I love that she did that. And I mean, we're better for it, that she kind of decided that this was her life's work, and work was just kind of what other work was what paid the bills. So Pamela.
Hi, I started reading Octavia Butler, I think it was the summer of 77. I was working, I did something to the sound, I don't know what it was, I can't hear you, but yeah, I read Mind of My Mind, and that was my first. And after that, I read Pattern Master, which the sound felt too much like a first book to me. Can you hear me? Because I can, okay. Then I read Wild Seed for the first time. I don't know how many times I've read Wild Seed. To me, Wild Seed is the best thing she's ever done. But I did go on to read Xenogenesis. I got Fledgling, don't like it. Got maybe a third or a halfway through Parable of the Sower. and decided that it was way too real for me. And have not finished, have not read Parable of the Talents. And I read science fiction. I started reading science fiction in 1969 with Dune. And then I did all Theodore Sturgeon and Robert E. Heinlein and all the old masters, Arthur C. Clarke, and going up through the years. These days, I'm more into speculative fiction. And when you talk about books that you could read, there's a host of women authors who write fabulous books about strong women characters. Jacqueline Carey and all of her Cushiel series. I don't think I ever met anybody like Phaedra No Delaney, who is the protagonist of her first 3 books. Lois McMaster Bujold, who doesn't always just write about women, but she writes very good fantasy. And it's Sarah Micklem. She wrote a book called Firethorn, and then the sequel, Wildfire. And I've been waiting 10 years for the 3rd book to come out. But Sarah Micklem and Firethorn is fantastic. And if you like speculative fiction as well as science fiction, I think you'd enjoy those authors. You know, they're not Black women writers, but they're very good. And several of those books I've read over and over again. So it's my little contribution.
Thank you.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah, I wonder if you could put some of that in the chat if you feel if you're able.
Oh yeah, sure.
Folks, if they want some new names. Sabrina, if you feel comfortable sharing. Maybe Sabrina's iPhone isn't, I know when folks are on iPhone, it's harder to toggle.
No, I am just not in a place where I can talk. I'm doing it really quick, sorry.
No problem. No problem. This is not required. I'm not giving grades.
But I will say really quick that I had the same feelings with Parable. I read it. I've read it a couple of times, but it's a lot.
Mm.
And is it Tasmanica or yeah.
Tasmanica, but yes, correct, absolutely. I just joined really late, but I saw people speaking about Octavia Butler on Facebook actually, and I saw Pamela had made a comment and was commenting on some of her writing and stuff, and then that's how I just found it. So I missed most of the things, but it's good to know that there are some other authors and some things that I can check out, and great. So thank you.
Well, thank you all for sharing. I do want to kind of maybe open up space if folks want to talk a little bit. Otherwise, we can kind of call it closed. Or if you have any questions that either I or one of our many kind of well-read Butler folks. We have quite a brain trust here with Butler, it seems. But otherwise, yeah, I really do appreciate all of you who showed up and stayed on. Does anybody want to say anything, ask anything, share anything? Yeah.
I guess while you're here, I was kind of curious for you to speak just briefly about what your forthcoming book is about. I just saw the title, and it's a very intriguing title.
Radical Satisfaction, Monstrous Work. Yeah, so it's actually about not science fiction. It's about mid-20th century Black women writers who are writing in the midst of segregation. And part of what I'm arguing is that they really are kind of not necessarily setting racial integration as their goal of writers, but instead a kind of less I would say, concrete goal of satisfaction, right? And by that, I mean kind of the capacity for Black women to feel at home and comfortable in the world that has nothing to do with whether or not white people accept them. So I'm really just thinking about that. The writers that I'm writing on are the poet Gwendolyn Brooks, a woman writer named Dorothy West, Ann Petrie, who wrote a novel called The Street, and another woman writer named, she's more of a playwright. Her name is Alice Childress, and she wasn't a communist, or she didn't say she was, but she had the FBI kind of followed her for about 5 years because they thought she was while she was writing. Kind of newspaper columns about domestic workers and kind of dignity, the dignity of domestic workers. So I'm really interested in, these questions of dignity and satisfaction. Thank you for asking that. It's far afield from Butler, sort of, but not really. Other questions?
Yes, thank you for asking that, because the books that you're writing sounds very good. So that's awesome. Thank you. Congratulations as well.
Oh gosh, thank you. Anybody else? I know I have to put up that last slide again. I just have to figure out how to do it. This is, you'd think by now with Zoom, I'd be a pro. But let me, hi, share screen and find the PowerPoint again. And let's see. There we go. I'm wondering if I can copy and paste it into the chat. That might be just as easy. I forget who asked for this. Was it you, Robin? Or yeah.
Yes, I was able to do a screen grab, so a little screenshot kind of thing. So
perfect.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, everybody. It is almost 8. It's quarter till. I, again, really appreciate you all for sticking around and for sharing your own experiences with science fiction, with Octavia Butler. I'm more than impressed with everybody's well-readness in terms of the genre, and in particular Butler. Really appreciative. And I think if we were in person, we probably could have a much more robust conversation. But I appreciate you sort of listening to me present. So I hope everybody has a great night. I'm going to stick on just in case Heather wants to say something to me. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Okay. All right. Is it over, Heather?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have to shut down the recording.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.